our online book talk program. And today's book talk author is Mr. Jaideep Hardikar. We would like to thank to Mr. Jaideep for having kindly agreed to review his newly published book, Ramrao, The Story of India's Farm Crisis. It is published by HarperCollins of India. Before we start a book talk, I will give a short introduction. Before we start a book talk, I will give a short introduction of the author of the book, and then there will be 45 minutes talk by Mr. Jaideep. Then after we will take a question answer session for 15 minutes for the participants. Mr. Jaideep Hardikar is a Nagpur-based senior journalist. He is also writer and researcher. He is a core member of the People's Archive of Rural India. He has worked with DNA and The Telegraph, among other publications. He also writes another book. The book title is The Village Awaits Doomsday. Thank you. Now, I request to Mr. Jaideep to take over the session and give the journey of the real life of Indian farmer. Mr. Jaideep.
Thank you very much, Madam, and thanks to the Vikram Sarabhai Library, and I thank my friend Professor Chinmay Tumbe too for having initiated this introduction, which has resulted into this sort of a conversation today. Before I start talking about the book, I would take this opportunity to display it for those who may not have seen it. This is the cover. Its title draws from my protagonist's name, Ramrao Panchleniwar. He is a cotton farmer, an average cotton farmer in Vidarbha, part of eastern Maharashtra, and sort of symbolizes a vast section of small and medium farmers that make up for the most of Indian farming or Indian peasantry. As you all know, that small and marginal farmers today comprise almost 90%, more than 80%, I would say, of the total land-owning peasantry in India. Around 1 hectare or less than 2 hectares of land. So Ramrao, in a way, typifies Indian farming community. And I chanced upon meeting him. I've been a reporter for almost 25 years, and my bulk of my reporting, or bulk of the focus of my reporting, has been on rural and agrarian issues, tribal communities of central India, land water conflicts. My previous work was basically looking at the issue of displacement, what happens to people who are displaced by development projects. And it was the extension of that work in 2000, when I started my journey in 96 as a journalist. I think migration, displacement, and farm suicide had just begun to kind of become a story, or become sort of started dominating the news in my region. I think it began with Telangana first, and then the similar sad trends were getting replicated, or we were witnessing the similar trends in cotton growing regions of Vidarbha, particularly 6 or 7 districts. Of course, today it's a ubiquitous or largely a pan-India phenomenon, but I will come to that later. While looking at the issue of displacement and traveling across the country, I realized that a lot of people were also migrating out. And they were migrating, some of them were migrating in distress, some of them, large sections of their were migrating as a part of their coping strategy to basically find livelihoods. Because as you know, one of the structural problems of Indian agriculture is that it is predominantly rain dependent, which means that you have to depend only on one crop. That is mostly Kharif when it rains, or in some parts of southern India, it's the middle, it's the October to or sort of August to February period when the receding rainfall hits the southern parts, and that's where the main crop people cultivate. But in large vast swaths and vast stretches of this country, uh, most of the farming communities depend on the Kharif crop, which is basically the monsoon and lasts until a period of November or maximum December. And after that, you have a long period of 6 to 7 months where people have no work, particularly in the areas where there is no industry or there is no fallback option. So people migrate to the smaller towns. So my second work basically was to look at migrations in central India. But while studying both the issue of displacement and why people migrate and where they migrate, I also realized that the structural problem, the problem of poverty, the problem of livelihoods is so predominantly linked with the problem of Indian agriculture. And I began to report on farm suicides around 97, 98, and they started picking up pace. Initially there were reports of 2 or 3 farmers unfortunately committing suicides in Vidarbha. Later on, that figure became twice 2 or 3 every day, and that number went on. So I began to look at this sad trend, and I must make a disclaimer here that I always say this, that I don't want to glorify suicide, so there's a caveat that anybody we know is in mental trauma or mental trouble, I think the help is just a calls away. You can prevent and avert that somebody from taking that extreme step if there is a counseling, or if there is someone to support such an individual. Be that as it may, the farm crisis and farm suicides were interwoven around and became an issue, particularly in Vidarbha, which then opened me. While I was reporting on all that, I was also trying to understand the economic turmoil or recession or sort of major changes that were occurring in the rural economy. Because mind you, mine is a generation which sort of began to ride on the so-called IT revolution, the service sector boom. I entered into a journalism field in 1996, and after 96, that later decade, you saw India's service sector booming, and service sector actually overtook the other sectors, namely agriculture and industrial sector. Today, bulk of our GDP comes from service sector, and you also saw massive migrations from rural parts to the semi-urban, smaller towns, tier 2, tier 3 cities, as well as metropolitan cities. But vast sections of Indian peasantry still survive on small parcels of land, 1 acre, 2 acre, and that's their only livelihood source as well. So my focus as a reporter has been what was happening to them. And I must say that one book and one person who actually changed the way my own worldview, as well as introduced me to this field of journalism, which we call rural journalism, is Mr. P. Sainath. And I have been a mobile student of his, trying to work alongside him, as we do in People's Archive of Rural India today. But back then, not many media houses were really interested. I remember my first long-term series of reportage from the field was in 2005, when I started working with a daily news and analysis, which was a newly launched newspaper in Mumbai. And I was reporting on not just the suicides, but the multiple aspects of rural economy. The credit structures, the agroecological problems, the soil health, the usurious, the usury, the indebtedness, the collapse of the rural banking network, migration, and the social problems, from single, from families who had just lost their main breadwinner to this crisis, to the struggles of the people, particularly the women farmers who were left behind in the families to take the onus of leading families and fending for them. I looked at for a year or so. I also looked at what happens to children. How does a child who has just lost a father or mother to the sad spiral of suicide, how does he or she cope with it? So while I was looking at these multiple stories, I began to expand also my geographical scope. I tried looking at what is happening in Marathwada, where I found that triggers or the overall contours and overall structural problems remain the same. Every region also brings into that quagmire of problems some new trends or some new problems. As you know, a region like Marathwada, which is the central Maharashtra territory, it's a drought-prone territory. It's a rain shadow area where you get abysmal rainfall. Your rainfall is less. So I saw migration plus suicides plus hunger as well in some of the families, and massive economic losses. You go to Chattisgarh, it's a predominantly paddy dependent area. It is abjectly poor. It used to be abjectly poor. Some of the areas have now are entering into the newly newly irrigated areas where the things are changing. But Chhattisgarh, Western Orissa, parts of Bundelkhand, deltas, Kaveri Delta, Krishna Delta, all these areas, or even northern Karnataka, which had a very high incidence of suicides, just as Vidarbha is, or Telangana, all these regions where I traveled to look at this, look at the life life of a peasant farmer, I realized that basically we are now entering into a phase which is, as Saina calls it, it's almost like a civilizational crisis, because it doesn't only, it's not an issue that only bothers peasantry per se. It now has begun to affect many of us directly or indirectly. So that was basically the setting of the idea for this book. And I was basically very clear that this book had to junk too much of panditry, or it should not become too much of an academic work. It's a serious subject. It's a subject that a lot of urban middle classes really don't understand too much about, and therefore have a free advice at will. Some of my own relatives and friends ask me, if they don't, if farmers don't earn money from cotton, why don't they grow capsicum? So all those questions, silly as they may sound, emerge from complete disconnect. I will not call ignorance, but a complete disconnect that people have today with agriculture. And also because the mainstream media do not report on rural or agrarian issues as a full-time beat. It's almost 50-60% of our country in terms of number of people engaged directly and indirectly with farming, and allied sector is massive. It still absorbs about 60-65% of Indian population. And there are regions and districts that are purely agrarian, where the economy is dependent on how agriculture performs. That led me to this idea that instead of writing a compendium like A Village Awaits Doomsday, I should look at life of an everyday farmer. And I have borrowed this tagline from People's Archive of Rural India, of which I am a roving reporter and also a core team member, that very often in the midst of debates over what kind of a policy mechanism, what kind of a policy prescription you should have to fix agrarian issues, are in more contemporary sense, there are heated debates in the newsrooms or in the drawing rooms or among friends, whether the 3 farm laws that have been just repealed by the central government, whether they were good or bad. what should we do? So there are acerbic and acidic debates that I feel are okay in democracy, but they miss. They are far, removed from the everyday realities of a farmer. That central sort of figure in the debate is missing. So if you read most of the reportage, or most of the writings on agrarian issues, it's dominated by opinion pieces. And being a reporter, I felt that I needed to bring the hinterland and heartland stories. And I had two options. A, I would have had to move around the country and look at different stories and bring them together. Or I could have deep dived into one story and really stayed with it for a very long time. And in 2014, when I was, I was reporting on the general elections, the run-up to general elections of 2014, around April, I chanced upon meeting my protagonist in his village. I was traveling in that area, and through an activist friend, I met him, and he had just come out of a traumatic, if dramatic event in his life. My first really reaction was to make sure he's all right. I didn't have a story in my mind. I was more concerned about the individual, because I have seen many individuals, many farmers who have slid back into clinical depression or the mental trauma phase, and have made multiple attempts subsequently as well on their life. So my first reaction was really to make sure that Ramrao is okay, that I should talk to him regularly. And I think over a period of time, I realized that, and I keep my notes meticulously. So every conversation, every time I went, then I would go to him often or call him on his phone. I began to see the possibility of a book. And therefore, in a year or two, I sought his permission, and I said, I would like to write a sort of a biography, but through you, I want to really write about what it is to be a farmer, an average farmer in the 21st century India. What is his daily life like? What are his struggles? And, are there ways or, possibilities that he himself explores to come out of the, vicious cycle of debt? Does he does he take initiatives, to improve his own livelihood, his own farming? Is he wanting to, progress on the front of mechanization, and so on and so forth? How does he deal with an issue of debt? And like, in the end, what does he earn? And where would he stand after putting all those efforts? Where does he stand vis-a-vis other sections of Indian society, particularly other sections of Indian economy? So those were the very, very fundamental question. And I wanted to tell basically a story to someone who may be willing to understand, or to make an effort to understand this issue, but may not really have a chance to access this issue. So I think there were multiple challenges. One was that I was writing this book for a very common audience. So this seemingly gory or very, difficult subject, far removed from the urban glitter, or, urban everyday life, or even semi-urban everyday life, this ought to be a story. So this book basically is an attempt I'm making to tell a story of an individual, and through him, I have attempted to take a historic look at my own region of Vidarbha, and also contextualize it in the processes that are affecting farming in general in our country. The deepening agrarian crisis, which is almost assuming the sort of scale of becoming a civilizational crisis. Also the processes of globalization that have affected our peasantry remotely, if not directly. So it's a simple story that I've tried to tell. And through the story, I've tried my best to explain multiple challenges that a farmer today faces. and the choices he makes and the reasons why he makes those choices, and generally, what are the implications of what kind of a choice he makes in the context he makes those choices. um, I just realized through the reporting process also that the the issue of agrarian crisis is not just limited to the aspects of economy. I mean, agrarian economics is an important issue. How do you make this unviable and unremunerative farming viable? What kind of interventions should states make or the central governments make? Should there be a direct intervention or an indirect intervention? All those questions are paramount or important. But also I realize that there are far bigger agroecological challenges also before the farmers. And I welcome you to read the book, because in the book you will realize that the soil health, for instance, is a massive area that has gone sort of unacknowledged and unaddressed for a very, very long time. Soil erosion, soil health, all this in the era of climate change, which are resulting in heavy to extreme rainfall events, particularly in central India, or recurring droughts in many parts of the country. Soil health becomes a very, very important aspect of Indian agriculture, particularly the production systems. I'm also seeing the drying up of perennial rivers, which are so very crucial to the availability of water in the sort of off monsoon years, because the river ecology has a direct connect with the groundwater tables, and the riverine, the post sort of seasonal rivers have direct impact on soil moisture in many parts of the country. I'm not talking about areas that are low, that receive less rainfall every year, but then there is a huge role that allied sector plays. And the more I spent my time on this book, researching the book, I realized that we've also messed up with the sort of beautiful synergy communities had developed over centuries between agriculture and animal husbandry, between agriculture and goat rearing. I think all that stands collapsed today, because we really did not make an effort to understand why did certain pastoralist communities or nomadic communities kept a certain animal, though they had access to land, or though they had land holdings, particularly semi-pastoralists or semi-nomads. I think in the last 20-30 years of globalization, sweeping changes have occurred in the countryside, and some of them get captured in the book as not in the foreground but in the background, because my protagonist remains embedded and wedded to his land. So I also have attempted to bring about the issue of a dignity and b sort of inequality that he suffers every day. So it's also the book is also about an average farmer in an unequal world. That really is about the story as well. And in the end, I think I've also tried to look at the larger framework, the legal, the structural, the policy frameworks, and what happened over I've been witness in Vidarbha to many studies that came up, to many state interventions that came up. There were farm waivers, there were doles here and there were compensation packages. In the end, nothing was worked, because I felt that nothing was tailored to kind of work on the ground. And I think, therefore, I sort of tried to raise some sort of an awareness among the audiences or readers who may not be directly linked with agriculture or agrarian world, particularly those who have now far moved away from the agriculture or agrarian societies. this book is for them, basically, to address to them, so that there is a little effort on their part also to participate in the debates that that dominate or that influence the government functioning. There was another reason also that I wanted to do this book, and it is about the way media frames or approaches these subjects. If you look at today's television media, digital media, or even the print media, even the regional languages don't have, as I said previously, um, they don't have full-time, full-time beat on rural areas. They don't look at life in the countryside. Um, so this was also an attempt to bring one of the attempts, and I've said it in the preface, that there are hundreds of stories that one can attempt about the changing rural world, and this is merely one. But it is important also for the heartland and hinterland. I'm based out of Nagpur. I have been a reporter in small town, and I love traveling in the countryside, particularly the heartlands and hinterlands that are generally not reported in the mainstream or so-called national media. So uh, 30, 40 years from now, if we were to look behind this era, I don't think there would be great many works around to really take a sociological or look at life of a hinterland farmer or a forest dweller or a rural dweller in a sense that would portray what kind of life existed during this period. What was it to be a farmer in the first 2 decades of this century? So it was also to bring the sort of a local perspective, of bottom up perspective of this issue. Generally, it's always the top down perspective, but here my attempt was to build a bottom up perspective on the issue, and again through the sort of through the storytelling. I think I'll stop here. I see it's already 30 minutes, but I see a few questions I take in the chat box. I think Rina, I'll take those 3-4 questions really to extend this further, and then maybe open it up for the
Yes,
other
sir.
panelists or the. So the
Yes.
first question is why female farmer suicides are considerably less than male farmers. Well, it has been this question has been addressed in many reports. You can look at IGIDR. You can look at um, if you look at the National Crime Record Bureau statistics, you will see that there's no specific gender related data on farm suicides. In fact, the data is now increasingly getting murkier because many states are not reporting on the farmer suicides. They report farmers suicides in the category called others, and many of the women farmers suicides actually get categorized as suicides by homemakers or housewives. So so there is an issue of data consistency or veracity of that data. But I have personally come across very many suicides by women farmers. Many of them were actually at the forefront of their family finances, or they were leading their families. They were the principal farmers, and their husbands had taken a back seat for whatever different reasons. But I have reported and have seen, I've come across many women farmers suicides as well, even children. If you go to PARI website, you will see some of the stories on how the altruistic suicides went up in a specific span, particularly among children. So there have been not many, but there has been this trend where even young children of the farming communities have committed suicide, leaving notes behind of the reasons why they were doing so. The second question is, have you noticed any difference in the real scenario after NAM Foundation's effort? Yeah, now NAM Foundation is an NGO for farmers started by actor Nana Patekar. I am a big advocate of any initiative that comes from community or through the agencies or actors like the NGOs or enterprises. But I see NAM Foundation or organizations that are working on watershed improvement, they have a limited role. uh, Farming is a complex process, and there are hundreds of verticals that a farmer has to deal with. There is an, as I said, there's an issue. It starts with production system. There are agroecological issues. Then there are issues related to seed quality, issues related to organic or inorganic fertilizers. There is an issue of credit. Then up to the market and up to the consumers. This journey from farm to consumer, you have several verticals. Water is one of them. It is an essential ingredient, because if you have water security, your crop choices or your choice to grow multiple crops, which will bring about diversity of resources or diversity of incomes, goes up. In some areas, yes, the effort has yielded better water tables, and communities have used that to sort of leverage and better their farming. But it doesn't bring about a sweeping, it hasn't brought about a sweeping change in economy as yet. There are, this process will have to go on, and state and voluntary sector will have to continuously build capacities, and continuously, watershed development is a continuous work. You cannot do it for 1 year and then not do it for the following years. So it has to go on. The third question is, as a journalist, how was your experience of reporting a farmer suicide for the first time? And does reporting farmer suicide become routine work for journalists after spending years in the field? For me, um, it was merely a window into the larger, deeper questions of farm economy, agriculture economy, even culture, social life, and the political life in the countryside. I uh, I don't report on suicide as per se, but I've tried to understand how people survive and subsist in the countryside. What is life like? Sometimes it is very unnerving. Personally, it has changed my worldview over the last 20 years, certainly. Um, 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 it has opened me to our society's deeper underbelly. Um, it's a society that is riddled with challenges, but it is also heartening to see that despite all these odds and trauma and the crisis, almost 22 and a half, 3 decades now, I also see a lot of resilience, which is a very humbling experience, because in order to see these communities you know cling on to some sort of a hope, which I feel is a utopia, they still don't give up. They don't give up very easily. So while it is unnerving, I at times I get angry at this inequality, or at the way things are. The resilience or struggles, or innovations that people make on the field, it's not all bad. There are farmers who innovate, there are communities that innovate, there are collectives that come together and build responses to this sort of crisis. I think it's heartening, and it gives me sort of hope that I think people are not just giving in, they are also trying to hold or hang in there and respond to that. I think some of my future work will be centered around these enterprising new collectives that are emerging in different parts of the country. Collectives around water, collectives around land, collectives around market access, interesting innovative market, aggregators, and so on and so forth. So I think um, this story was mainly important only to see an average farmer's life, and bring it closer to the general audiences who beyond the academic and journalistic and scholars who have engaged with this issue. This is basically for any common audience, common general reader who wants to understand it. If he picks up the book, he might get to through the story, he might get to understand a few nuances of it. um, for me, it's not a routine work. I take my rural journalism very seriously, um, um, because I believe that the story or story of rural India or stories of rural India are equally important, because unless you understand, unless you have a full scope or full scape of your society and your country, it cannot progress, it cannot develop. It is challenging because someone like me have no resources to put into sustained reporting, and reporting, is getting even more difficult with media houses collapsing, or media itself structurally changing, and space shrinking. But I think for many journalists it may have become just, I mean, I must confess that uh, the amount of reporting that you saw in, say, the first decade of this century, and then over the last 5-6 years, you see that there has been very less reporting on regions, and partly because the media houses have done away with their regular reporters from many parts of the country. So I think that has affected. But for someone like me, I can't speak for others, but for someone like me, I think it is not a routine work. I think it's a part of an important story, and that is what we try and do at People's Archive of Rural India: bring stories of people who otherwise don't find voices, or otherwise don't get reported in the so-called mainstream print and television media. So I also welcome you all to have a look at People's Archive of Rural India, to see a new kind of media emerging there as well. The fourth question is, most farmer suicides are committed for really small amounts, mostly around 20,000. What's the reason? Is the execution of government schemes for farmers failing? Well, it depends on case to case. The triggers would be very different. But I think it's not just the amount of indebtedness that is important. The larger feeling is, as one woman farmer, Saraswati Ambarwar, once told me, that she has stopped dreaming. And I think in my book I've mentioned that I think it's a even greater a crisis if you stop dreaming, or if you think that I can't dream anymore. You are looking at building a society. How can it progress if you don't have dreams? So this sort of helplessness that someone like a 15-year-old boy called Vishal Dhude, he was a 10th standard student coming from village called Dadham in Vidarbha, near Akula district. This boy ended himself one day, leaving a note and telling his uncle that I don't see my life going anywhere, because he would go to his school and see the difference between him and his other batchmates, that his father would not be able to. He came from a very poor tribal family in a dryland agriculture region, just about 3 acres of land. Two brothers, one was already out of school and he was helping his father, and this boy wanted to study, but he did not see his life go anywhere. And at that age of 15, he took that decision, unfortunate decision, and he snapped his life. What does it tell us? It's the death of the dream, or it's this sort of realization or inability to sort of see a roadmap that gives you hope within the community. So the onus is on us, probably, both as reporters or as citizens. That's why I feel that somewhere we are failing to even give this message. The polity, of course, there are problems with the government schemes and programs that I talk about greatly in the book, in the passing, of how government programs and schemes are limited in their scope and in their vision. We now need sort of this issue now needs a countrywide churning of region to region, state to state, district to district. What is the roadmap? What is the broader roadmap we are going to take? What kind of state interventions are needed? What are the different models that are working? We haven't even begun to study the models that are working on the ground. And do these models inform, or we can inform, can these models of collectives or individual enterprises of us or a certain region shifting away from a certain cropping pattern to a more sustainable agroecological systems, can they inform the national policies, or is the policy making of around agriculture only limited to a few bureaucrats in the central government or in the state government? Because that's how you see suddenly some laws come and without debates are bulldozed through the parliament or through the legislative assemblies, and within a year's time you see, despite COVID, the swelling groundswell of sort of opposition to it, and farmers taking to roads and finally the government withdrawing it. I mean, this sort of thing happens only when you don't debate or you don't go into the complexities to sort of begin to address the crux of the problem. I remember that in the early 1990s, when the hybrid varieties came, they were said to be the magic pills. Then came then came the wave of genetic engineering, and it was said that it will change the face of the farmers. But if you move on the ground, all you see is more stagnation. The production goes up and then falls down. It's like green revolution happening in 4 or 5 years, and technology is only one part of it. So I think as a society, we now have to sort of engage with this issue. That is where I think that is why that how to go about it, what kind of platforms we need. We will need both the academic and intellectual world, apart from the civil society, take that discussion forward. And I see more movement towards that. There are many good organizations that are now engaging deeply, both on the policy front and on the programmatic front. But state governments are clueless right now. There's no doubt about it, because you have to address the issue, because it's also political. It has a huge consequence for the electoral politics, and also for the economy of the country. But what kind of systems, what kind of approach to take, I think there are no clues about that. Fifth question is, compared to farmers in Punjab, as compared to farmers in
Punjab,
why farmers in Vidarbha region have had to face so much problem of poverty? It's not just Vidarbha's story is from the richest to rags. My next work concerns the story of the first Tata venture and the growth of cotton economy in my region, and the post-independence, particularly post Green Revolution, and particularly in the post-liberalization age, how that economy sunk in. So it's not the issue of poverty per se. Even Punjab farmers face a lot of indebtedness, and farmers crisis and farm suicides have also been happening there, in certain regions more so. But I won't go into the details, because there are several studies that we can refer to, both in terms of comparing regions to regions, and how does I think the nature of the crisis, overall contours remain the same, but maybe you might find a new spiral in Punjab that you may not find in Vidarbha. In Vidarbha, certain issues would be different from that of Punjab, but from farm to fork, the agroecological problems, the problems with credit, the problems of market, the problem of income, that remains the same. The incomes have been either stagnant or falling. Relative incomes have been either stagnant or falling. And if you see it with inflation and the standard of living, the high standard of living, that income is not enough to sustain your aspirations or sustain your livelihood. I think that's the issue. Vidarbha has its own peculiar problems. If you read the book, I think you will get some of the answers to this question. What are basic differences you find between the farmers of Punjab and farmers from Chattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar? I think it's a question that I'll probably address later, because it's a very profound question. Each state has a different cropping pattern, a different agroecological system, a different economic framework. Punjab is a state which has strong markets, particularly the agriculture producing market committees are very strong, and over 95% of the produce, particularly wheat and paddy, is procured by the state. For for the central pool, because that's where the green revolution to the public distribution system, that chain in which there were three pillars. One was the assured procurement, minimum remunerative price, minimum support price, and production systems, meaning quality seeds and other inputs were sort of built into that architecture some 30-40 years ago, and it is now an integral part of not just agrarian economy of Punjab, but also the overall economy of Punjab and also social life. Whereas in Chhattisgarh model actually evolved after the state came into being, where the one single crop of paddy is now fully procured by, meaning it depends also, again, like Punjab, it depends on the procurement by the state. And this was a new area which added during the 2004 to 2014 period, which began to contribute more and more into the central kitty, central pool of grain, and sustained the farmers. The state government began to also incentivize the farmers by giving them an additional money over and above the minimum support price, which they called bonus, and then developed a chain of mills, particularly rice mills in the state. So their model is different. Jharkhand and Bihar are the least, they don't have agriculture produce marketing committees as APMC markets, as we call, or mandis, well developed. And therefore, a few months ago, there was a comprehensive study that looked at Odisha, Karnataka, Punjab, and Bihar, system, and they found that the farmers in Bihar have to resort to distress sales off and on, and if the prices fall below the minimum support levels, particularly of the 23 commodities that are part of the MSP regime, the farmers really have nowhere to go but to sell in distress, because MSP works only when there is a state intervention at procurement level. So in Bihar, it doesn't exist. So, the Bihar markets are down, and therefore you see massive migrations out of Bihar seasonally, even during the season times. But there are other issues as well, of particularly in the Indo-Gangetic phase, the several sort of severe flooding, regular flooding is also one cause of, or a push factor in that area. This is a question, I'm sure it has come out as a masterpiece, but I would like to comprehend the hardships you had to face while articulating the exact sentiments of a survivor. I don't know whether it is a masterpiece or not. I think that I leave it to my basic attempt was to tell a story, and I have done that to the best of my abilities. I think some other person would have done better. I was wanting to tell a story of my time as a chronicler of my time, and I know that I am a reporter. I don't wear the shoes of an expert, or I'm not in the role of an academician or a scholar who would go deeper. But this was also, I used some of my sociological background or grounding in sociology to understand the life and put it in the context. So this was basically the work. This is basically work of a journalist, and that is the caveat I give. So you might find that certain things are missing, but they were by choice. I left because I felt that the story had to be lucid. There will be other works that I will attempt in the future, where I'll bring probably more insights into the other aspects of rural and agrarian life. But please do read it, and your critical feedback will be important.
Sir,
one thing question. While articulating the exact sentiments, I mean, the major challenge that I faced here was that I had to stay focused on my protagonist. It is his story, it is not my story. I am merely a storyteller. So my challenge was to not overpower or dominate his thought, or sort of tweak his thoughts sort of put my thoughts into his mouth. So I was mindful of this fact that I should not be seen by the reader as too dominating in the narrative. And I think I'll leave it to you. When you read it, please let me know whether you find my voice in the, I wanted to stay in the background just as a storyteller. It is his story. He is the hero and he is the one who is telling his story. I'm merely a storyteller, and I sort of bring about some analysis from time to time. Yeah. Are there any farmer mental health initiatives from any state government or organizations that should be appreciated? There have been a couple of interesting, social action research experiments, particularly one called Vikram in western part of Vidarbha, which lasted for 18 months, where they put in cottage hospitals, they brought some mental health counselors, particularly psychology and psychiatrists also. And what they found in 18 months was that in the first month, the number of people seeking redress to their complaints was less, and the number of suicides in that region, in that area, was more. As they progress, the number of people seeking mental health or seeking counseling went up spirally, but the number of farm suicides actually dropped. So that experiment and those papers are still out in the public domain. That was a really good indication, but I think India faces a tremendous shortage of mental health professionals, and it is not seen as an important area, even from the health point of view. But here I would recount what my friend Dr. Sujay Patil once told me. It would be like, cleaning your floor dry, or wanting to clean your floor dry while keeping the tap open. So unless you fix economic, social, many other spirals or many other aspects of agrarian economy or agrarian society, I don't think we would be even making some meaningful attempts to fix this issue, or to at least bring it to some scale where we'll be able to deal it in a better way. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So I think now more questions are not there. So thank you for you take the reader on the journey of everyday life of Indian farmer, his struggles and many failings. So through this book, we can understand the day-to-day crisis of the challenges in the farmer's life. So I think all the participants can read and go through if they have more questions, they can ask through our emails. We can share the emails to the participants.
But I'm really thankful, Reena, that you invited me for this talk. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable talk and give time to us also. It's a wonderful book talk.
Thank you.
Also, thank to all the participants for joining in this book talk. The Professor Chinmay, sir, has some questions, sir?
No, I just like to thank Jaideep for this very, very important book that he's written. And I hope people out here, many of them who work on agriculture in the participant list, I can see, actually read the book and benefit from it. So that's all I'd like to say. Yeah.
On behalf of Vikram Sarabhai Library, I thank you to Mr. Jaideep and the Professor Chinmay Tumbe, Johnny, and all the participants. Now we close the book talk. Yeah. Thank you so much.